Welcome to the Roundtable. Are personalised nutrition services an essential tool?
Good question.
I'm joined by two of the most interesting, entertaining and thought-provoking figures from the world of health, fitness and well-being.
Do you agree with this?
Yes and no.
We'll also be shining the spotlight on a number of celebrity scientists, whether you can really trust these social media superstars.
Oh, sinner.
Or whether they're simply pushing advice to drive their own commercial agenda.
Throw enough shit at a wall and it sticks. That's Michael Mosley.
Welcome to the Unfiltered RoundTable. Today, I'm joined by Nick Mitchell, CEO and founder of Ultimate Performance, and Dr Alan Flanagan, the founder of Alinea Nutrition. I never know how to pronounce it. What's the best way of pronouncing it?
Alinea, yeah.
Alinea Nutrition. I wanted to kick off with talking about, Alan, your latest contribution to the Unfiltered website. We have a conversation about personalised nutrition and the services and the app-based products around that. And I think it's fair to say you don't pull any punches. So I was hoping we could dive into why you are so down on these personalised nutrition services. But firstly, can we have sort of a top-line take on what are these apps, what are these services offering, in your opinion, in terms of the marketing? And then perhaps we can, all three of us, have a conversation around where maybe there's a misalignment between what they're saying and what they're actually offering. So top line is kind of a blood sample. Some have got a stool sample and also continuous glucose monitoring. That's kind of the bare bones of what these products are offering, right?
They're basically offering various combinations of testing and kind of lab testing that, you know, someone might, in some cases, you could do with your GP, like a blood cholesterol test, or in some cases you might need more specific testing for glucose tolerance. And usually that would be done in a clinical setting using an oral glucose tolerance test where you drink 75 grams of glucose and then blood samples are taken afterwards. And that would be our kind of gold standard. So in the absence of being able to do that, you've got these devices like continuous glucose monitoring. And then you've got the ability now to look at stool samples and look at particularly bacterial composition of stool samples. The basic premise, and it's important to kind of lay out this prior, all of this fits under this paradigm known as personalized nutrition, or PN. And the basic premise of PN is that by using this level of sophistication in terms of individual level data, that we not only are going to be able to treat, or so to speak, if that individual is managing a disease, but more specifically, the real promise of personalized nutrition, as its advocates tout, is that this is actually about prevention. Now, most of nutrition and dietetics research and practice is focused generally on, well, we've now got this person with the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. How do we now address and manage that condition? So the promise of PN is we can now take otherwise healthy people and start to really personalize their, you know, diet and lifestyle recommendations so that they never get that disease in the first place. So that's kind of the big promise of it. It very much relates to this kind of idea of, you know, that we're individualized. You know, we're all individuals. We all have slightly different responses potentially to the same, you know, meal or whatever. And so there's the idea then that if we look at, for example, our population advice, we typically have dietary guidelines and they're designed to be quite broad. And again, the sell of personalized nutrition is, well, that's not actually good enough at the individual level. We need to be able to tailor, you know, advice much more specifically according to this particular individual. And so I think that's a good definition for personalized nutrition, is the provision of very specific nutrition advice tailored towards the modification or of avoidance of disease risk based on individual genetic variability and the relationship between that individual's genetic makeup and, for example, their, you know, stool microbiome or their blood glucose tolerance or their, you know, cardiovascular risk factors like blood cholesterol.
This all sounds great, though, right? This is the silver bullet to fixing all kinds of problems. Where's the disconnect? Why are you so down on it?
The disconnect arises, I think, if we take, well, one way I like to think about how we might approach personalized nutrition, thinking about personalized nutrition, is we can take some of those premises we've just outlined. So one is the idea that personalized nutrition is about avoiding risk or minimizing risk rather than treating a condition once someone's arrived at that point. So that's one potential theme we can think about it through. The other is this idea that it's individualized rather than just kind of broad and more population focused. And then the third, and this is probably one of the most important, is, well, it's it's precision nutrition, not generic dietary advice. And I think if we start to pick apart those kind of three themes, very quickly there's a disconnect between the actual evidence that we have published to date supporting this approach versus the kind of rush to commercialize a lot of the related products that are coming out of personalized nutrition. So, for example, the idea that risk rather than treatment is like we can manage someone's risk preceding that might suggest that there is some degree of advantage that some of these approaches would provide over a kind of broader treatment approach. But if you look at some of the published research in this area to date, that doesn't really bear out. So there's a really good example of a trial that was done across a couple of European countries called the Food for Me study. And the idea was that you would have a couple of groups. You would have one control group was just given conventional dietary advice, generic dietary guideline advice. Then you would have one group that was doing personalized nutrition. And that was not personalized nutrition from the apps and tech stuff. It was just personalized dietary advice from a dietitian based on that individual's, baseline diet. Then you had another personalized nutrition group, which added in the kind of blood markers and additional, body fat measurements and stuff to try and further tailor the precision of their advice. And then you had that group plus the addition of genetic interactions of their genetic testing results, in addition to the blood markers and the body fat percentage, etc. And basically there was no additional benefit beyond just getting some individualized advice from a dietitian. And when you looked at the specific changes to diet that were made in those groups, it was things like, well, they lowered sodium intake and they improved on their overall healthy eating score and they lowered their total red meat intake. So the actual changes made were entirely within what is currently our broad population advice. And there was no additional advantage to the phenotyping and genotyping personalized nutrition over and beyond what they might have achieved from just getting dietary advice either from our guidelines or from a dietitian. So again, it starts to kind of unravel in some of its major claims that there is a degree of specificity that allows people to somehow gain an advantage in how they would reduce their risk. And then there's some other studies. I think one particular point we'll have to discuss in detail is the idea of kind of inter-individual variation in blood glucose continuous glucose monitor responses. But that off the bat, I think that's one example of where clearly, based on current knowledge, there's not really much of an advantage being gained here above and beyond what we currently know, or kind of the best ways to manage future disease risk from a dietary perspective, at least.
Nick, I want to bring you in at this point because there's probably no man on the planet that's got more people into shape and body composition improvements than you. What's your top line take on personalized nutrition? Is it something that you do with Ultimate Performance clients? Is it something you're interested in yourself? What's your take?
I take a slightly more charitable view in that I look at all of this, let's call it fancy stuff, to use very layman's terms. And on a micro level, on an individual level, I don't believe that the science is there yet for it to make a difference. I would be curious as to Alan's view as to whether he thinks the science will be there to make a difference at some point in time.
this point in the research, I think it depends on what exactly, I guess, what aspects specifically of personalized nutrition we might be talking about. Some of the methodology that's being used in some of the bigger personalized nutrition trials from a purely research perspective, I think is very interesting. And I think from the perspective of nutritional epidemiology, there could be some application to some of the ways that they've gathered data for some of these trials. Could be useful to get a more rich data set for observational research. But I think as far as some of the specific elements to the aspects of personalized nutrition that are kind of being touted as, you know, its major benefit, there's some areas where I just think that's unlikely to happen. And there's some areas where I'm still kind of slightly more skeptical, but open to seeing where the research evolves too. So I'll give two concrete examples from the evidence in relation to that. One is specifically in relation to the microbiome. And this is, you know, and more specifically the microbiota, the composition of bacteria that make up the human digestive tract and the influence of that composition on human health. Now, this is an area where we are still just scratching the surface. And one of the big kind of developments in that specific field in the past year or two was last year, in about May of last year, there were two studies published. Now, personalized nutrition devices and apps and products, and indeed in the research, relies on stool samples to look at the composition of bacteria in stool. Now, so does most of the research in that area prior to that. So there was nothing outlandish necessarily about that. But insofar as it was a research area where we were starting to kind of run away with some conclusions, almost the cart, you know, kind of before the horse. Last year, two studies were published which used more kind of advanced methods to look at the composition of bacteria in stool related to the composition of bacteria, for example, further inside the kind of large intestine and other areas of the digestive tract. And basically what they found was that there was a big difference in the composition of the microbiota, of the microbiome, between these different areas of the digestive tract. And what it meant practically was that stool samples were not actually providing an accurate picture of the composition in other areas of the digestive tract. And yet we've been using stool samples to try and make these really broad inferences that the composition of the bacteria of the stool and other characteristics of the microbiota that would be in stool, therefore is a window into the entire human gastrointestinal tract. And these studies have basically called into question the validity of that interpretation, which means that the entirety of that particular aspect of personalized nutrition is itself called into question. And the fact that these, in a commercial sense, are using, you know, stool samples and telling people, well, modify your diet accordingly, like that evidence simply isn't there. And I don't know at this point that is something. I think they're still, based on those studies published last year, you know, we still need to really see where that whole area of research into, you know, the microbiota and the microbiome ends up going and what new advancements in methodology might bring us. So maybe at some point there will be more knowledge that applies to diet and recommending diet changes and specific components of diet to people based on what data we get from gastrointestinal analysis. But the idea that it's currently available really is not something that I think anyone could stand over. And then I think the continuous glucose monitoring element and the glycemic variability, a lot of that is otherwise healthy people now pathologizing normal physiology. Like, yes, your blood glucose increases after a meal. And there's been a couple of publications as well that have kind of shown that there's a discrepancy, there's a discord between the readings that you might get from a continuous glucose monitor versus the readings that you might get with a kind of gold standard blood sample based oral glucose tolerance test. that discord might get greater as people's body fat increases. That's one factor that could influence it. There's others as well. Then there's also the technology themselves. There's some evidence that different CGMs produce different readings to the very same meal in the same person. So the same person is eating a meal, and they've got two different CGM devices on, and they're getting two different readings from that. So there's methodological issues with this evidence. There's technological factors that are influencing some of the findings potentially. And so again, is that something that could improve as the actual technology gets better? Absolutely. It's something that could improve over time. So like any area of science, I'm always open to the fact that this evidence may get better, and methodological improvements and technological improvements in terms of the technology used to get these measurements might improve and likely will improve. And it will be interesting to see how that influences the quality of the evidence coming out. But as things currently stand, I think my big worry is we're seeing this rush to commercialize products that are way out above and beyond anything the evidence is allowing them to claim. But that's not stopping the commercialization of the products, and it's certainly not stopping these kind of grandiose claims being made that are really unrelated and quite divorced from the strength of the evidence from the available personalized nutrition trials that have been conducted to date.
We recognize there is a commercial necessity in developing these products, correct? As in, commerce drives the science.
It depends.
It has to drive the science, because without the commerce, no one is going to put the money into the science. Would you agree with that?
It can be, but I mean, fields like nutrition research typically aren't commerce driven because food and nutrients and diets are not something you can patent. So certainly in kind of pharmaceutical research, kind of commerce drives science. They need to produce drugs that are profitable and effective in order to be profitable. And so basically what I'm saying to answer your question is yes and no. Traditionally, nutrition research hasn't been like commerce driven. It's typically relied on public health, government funded grants, from a more altruistic perspective of this is quite important to understand from a population health standpoint. But now with the development of these new technologies, we're seeing a kind of merging of the technological and therefore kind of commerce-driven element with the kind of public health side. And indeed, again, part of the personalized nutrition marketing is, this is going to benefit from a public health perspective, although we can question that. So I think this area specifically of nutrition research is to an extent commerce-driven, although some of the technologies used in it, CGMs, for example, have a long-standing use in type 1 diabetes management. So they weren't developed specifically for this kind of paradigm of research.
Putting aside potentially vulnerable people using these products or these products being missold, both of which we can all see are very, very valid concerns and possibly override everything else. Given the commercial necessity for companies to kind of put the work in to develop these products, if people could look at these products in the way that I kind of look at them, as interesting to use, not slavishly follow, science definitely not set, and keep it all in perspective, is this a bad thing in your view, if context and perspective can be maintained?
For someone that was very alive to all of what we're discussing, and they were aware of that, potentially not. But there is also the potential, and this was a point made in a recent paper, and it was put quite well. It was a paper that was on the reliability of continuous glucose monitors, and this was in participants had worn two different devices from different companies and got very different readings from their blood glucose, from their continuous glucose monitoring. It's interstitial glucose it's measuring, not blood glucose. And the point that they made was that the danger here is that people end up making bad dietary choices to achieve potentially illusory glycemic benefits. So while in general, to your point, no, someone that's alive to the fact that this is far from settled science, that it's really an emerging area, and that was, not getting obsessive over, the data that they were getting and whatever, there's still the potential that with some of the technology that they're utilizing, that they're actually not getting the kind of representation that they think they're getting, and the data doesn't actually mean what they think it means. And so in that case, I think there potentially is still an issue, because it's not even delivering on that element of the promise, for someone that even is kind of aware of the potential limitations. So I think this is where we arrive at when the kind of the commercialization of some of these products out kind of runs the evidence from which these products are being developed. And I think it would have been interesting to see just more of these trials done and funded, and bigger studies to actually get more of a handle on the kind of utility and accuracy and precision. I think this comes back to one of the themes we identified at the start: individual versus population. I think at one level, individuals that, are entitled to make their own decisions, and a certain individual could probably utilize some of this stuff in a way that they found useful, or at least interesting, on their own individual health journey. But part of the problem when stuff like this goes public and is marketed to the public at large is that individual kind of is still in there, but they're now in there stacked up against a whole bunch of other individuals that maybe are not necessarily so live to the fact that this is still emerging science, and are making, decisions with their diet they might not need to make, or are spending just a lot of money. As Joe said, like, this really is targeting the worried well in many respects, for benefits that they would otherwise be able to get just from doing or applying current knowledge. And that to me is what this really comes back to. If you look at the kind of predictive benefit of some of the personalized nutrition stuff, especially when it comes to glucose management, you don't really see anything that someone probably couldn't get just from applying knowledge we currently have. So yeah, I think what and I guess it's the same, Nick, with training, right? I mean, what is the cost of someone? Take two people and you just tell one person to apply some tried and true methods and lift compound lifts and stay consistent for 6 months, and the other person is going from kind of gimmick to gimmick, and who's going to make more progress in that kind of context over 6 months. And that's it's a crude analogy, but it's one that I think is where I see some of the PN stuff now, that I think people start jumping at the gimmicky stuff rather than just, trying to, do some of the basics that we know.
But here's the thing, here's the one point, and I feel like I'm defending personalised nutrition when I honestly don't have an extra ground at all in it, right? And we don't do any of this stuff. The gamification of any aspect of one's lifestyle can help some people adhere to that lifestyle and keep them engaged with it. And so I would argue, and again, at the end of the day, are people getting value for money? That's a very individual thing, right? So I agree with all of your points, but I would also say there is a gamification element to it, and that gamification keeps some people engaged and keeps them on track. I would say that. So that's why I'm less against some of these things, but I completely accept and understand and agree with all of your points.
In many respects, it feels as though at the moment it's kind of almost reinventing the wheel, right? And to use that training analogy, I think works perfectly. If you do the basics, and Nick, I've trained underneath you, right? It's the basics when it comes to lifting, and it was the basics that when it came to what I was eating, and I think those rules probably remain the same. It's eating whole foods, it's eating what your grandparents would eat, it's food from the land. At the moment, it feels like these personalized nutrition services aren't really telling us anything above that. But the potential downside, Alan, as you mentioned, in terms of the worried well, there are obvious concerns there, which leads into the next thing I wanted to ask you both about is the people promoting these services. They're not just some influencer who's got a decent following. These are serious academics. These are researchers. And I wanted to move into the second part of this conversation around this kind of new cult we have of celebrity scientists. Now, Alan, I know your views on this because we've talked about this at length already. So I want to start with you, Nick. We've seen a proliferation of these celebrity scientists, Tim Spector, Andrew Huberman, Peter Attia. There's a number of really big, almost household names now that have crossed over into the mainstream consciousness, who come from a very, very rigorous scientific background, who are now offering prescriptive lifestyle behaviors. Top line, what's your take on what we're seeing here in terms of elevating the conversation, getting this message to the masses, but also some of the concerns around it?
Well, you're just taking the words out of my mouth. They elevate the conversation, and I see them as a gateway to people digging deeper and being more interested. I see them as the reverse of the coin, the same coin as Joe Wicks. Funnily enough, Joe Wicks is a massive guy. I mean, Joe Wicks and Andrew Huberman, these are not two names you put together automatically, right? But what Joe Wicks has done, you could argue, has oversimplified things and has this massive gateway, massive funnel of people who've come looking into fitness, thinking about their health, thinking about what they should eat. And this huge funnel has drawn people in, and then people decide where they go from there. And I would say the same, but with a different audience, with someone like a Huberman. He's massively influential. He has got people thinking about the nuanced ways of living more healthily. Some of his messages, I think we can broadly agree, some of his messages, getting out into sunlight, those kind of things, are making people think more than they would otherwise have thought. And then it's about taking the rest with a pinch of salt. And it goes back to my views with personalised nutrition. It's are people smart enough and nuanced enough to take things with a pinch of salt and to understand that content is king, and these people are just pushing content out relentlessly, and therefore they can't exercise the same due diligence over this vomiting of constant content.
Alan, Nick there, I think, has come down net positive ultimately. So long as someone is intelligent and can use a little bit of their own initiative to separate maybe some of the more sexy stuff from the basics. Would you go along with that? Net positive or net negative?
For someone like Nick or myself or you, Joe, or someone that has an understanding of health and good critical thinking ability to actually do that, I don't think that that's a problem, because you're in and people are in then a good position to be able to hear a claim and say, that sounds a bit far-fetched, or I wonder what evidence supports that claim. I think the problem for me with the likes of Huberman and Spector now is, and there's a kind of wider conversation here that I've been thinking about a lot. We're in a kind of post-science era currently, or what I would call the post-modernization of science. So typically science is something that's been done to really be focused on the methods that you're using to find a relationship, to really try to drill down and understand a relationship between an exposure and an outcome. And what we're now seeing is science is increasingly becoming a kind of relativist endeavor. Whereas previously we tried to be as objectivist as possible, understanding everyone has their own biases or their own kind of, life experience that make up how they view things. The aim of kind of scientific epistemology and developing the method that we call science was a way of trying to get people to be able to actually have their own individual personal views and, politics and everything else, and to try to supersede that with a way of appraising claims about reality, claims about the world. And that allowed us to make sense of the world around us. And what we're having now increasingly is this very postmodern relativist view. Evidence is what you want it to be. You can find a study that supports kind of almost anything, whether it's a human study, a randomized control trial, or an experimental study in rats or mice, isn't really relevant as long as it says what you'd like it to say. And to the average person in the population, thinking that that's science is a really kind of dangerous place, I think, to get to, because then science loses all of its meaning. And we're in this kind of area where truth, from a scientific standpoint, is whatever you'd like it to be to suit the claim you'd like to make. And so for me, Huberman, Tim Spector, they really represent this kind of relativism and this rendering of science as a language game rather than as a method of integrity that allows us to get closer to some approximate truth about the nature of our reality. And I know that's a bit meta and kind of conceptual, but I do see that as a big threat to the idea of scientific integrity, because if Andrew Huberman makes a pretty bogus claim about something to do with nutrition, but he's dressed it up in the language of science, and then someone comes along to me and asks me for my view on that same claim, and I give an answer by referring to science and evidence, how does that individual know the difference between me or an Andrew Huberman? Because we've both used the language of science. So now how do you get to the actual answer? You've got two answers to the same question dressed up in the same language, and no one has the ability to resolve it. So I don't think that's a really helpful place to us to get to. And ultimately, it does come back to the commercialized factor. Someone like an Andrew Huberman is incentivized to play fast and loose because of the growth of Huberman Lab podcasts. Someone like Tim Spector is incentivized because of Zoe, to push claims far beyond where the evidence that would support those claims currently is. And I don't think that trend is going anywhere. I think this increasing commercialization and kind of postmodernization of science.
Is it a trend? Or has it not always been this way? Didn't Kellogg's once have their own, probably, research version of a research lab? Isn't this just human nature? And these guys are, as social media has grown individuals versus corporations, it's now just done on an individual basis versus a corporate level?
By trend, I don't mean, say, fad necessarily. I mean, something that over time has been there. There are antecedents to this, absolutely. I mean, one good example here, obviously, to go back to a very pre-social media era would be, the kind of 50s and 60s when the evidence for smoking's adverse effects was coming out, and you had the big tobacco companies putting together their own research institutes and scientists and producing a kind of counterbody of pseudo evidence, basically, to try and avoid, any sort of regulation on tobacco products. But the age we're living in now, like you say, Nick, social media, the internet age, this kind of proliferation of information at speeds that are, beyond anything that would have been communicated in the kind of pre-internet era. I think that's allowed this to have a kind of exponential growth. So yeah, I think insofar as this is now our reality, and these media channels are what we communicate through. Yeah, I think it's something that is definitely here to stay. But I do think that makes it's a kind of weird place we're in now, right? Because your average person that's just generally interested in their health is now also interested in this thing we call science, right? Everyone likes to be seen as evidence-based, no matter what, whether they're a personal trainer, whether they're a dietitian, whether they're a physiotherapist. That's the kind of hot ticket right now, is everyone wants to be seen to be doing and engaging with and talking about this thing called science. And so we're all kind of doing this dance, around this thing called science. And for the average person, it's almost impossible for them to distill what's true within that versus what is not. Whereas previously, science was very much more about that process of being able to, to try and drill down to at least some approximate truth or some approximate reality. And I think a good, again, to round out with that smoking example, ultimately those efforts failed. They delayed things for a couple of years, but the kind of scientific truth and reality of what was going on ultimately did win out. Whereas now we'll never have the ability to kind of get to that final resolution because of our channels of communication and social media. So we'll constantly just be doing the same kind of iterations of what is true versus what is not true over and over, I think, kind of in perpetuity.
I'll kind of summarize my view. My view is that these guys and women, these people having these conversations open us up to more and more discussions. You've got the likes of Huberman. He's risen so high. Huberman was a messianic figure at one point. The shine is coming off Huberman now. So he's getting bigger and bigger, and then there are checks and balances as you get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think, honestly, it's kind of the natural order of things. And then ultimately, my view would be, do I look at a Huberman and think this guy is potentially a bad actor? I think he's got a little bit more of an agenda than he gives out, because he tries to give out this wholly altruistic persona. But I don't think that Huberman is a bad actor. I think there are other people out there that are bad actors that are just selling snake oil. Do you? I'll ask you a direct question, Alan. Do you think Huberman is a bad actor?
I find it tricky because that comes with a lot of assumptions about his character that I don't know. And so what I try to avoid, like what it comes down to me is, does he put out information that, if to me what it comes down to is, you've got someone who is a tenured scientist at an institution like Stanford. So to the point you made about the scientific method, Nick, you're absolutely correct. But there is no way I can envisage someone like an Andrew Huberman doesn't understand that method and doesn't understand what gives that method integrity. So to my mind, the information that he puts out, he is either of the knowledge, he either knows that the information he's putting out is speculative or experimental science or not very well supported, or he's not quite aware, because he speaks to a lot of different areas of science that he obviously wouldn't have domain-specific expertise or knowledge in all of those areas, or he's just not aware of that, or not aware of the context of that field, and he's putting it out anyway. And to me, if not bad actor, because there's a lot of, again, like I said, there's a lot of implications for his character that I wouldn't want to get into because I don't think it's necessary. It's definitely reckless. And I think we can be pretty clear as to why it's being done, which is the commercial success of the podcast. And I do want to be clear that, like, when it comes to a lot of this misinformation landscape, the reason that, like, I have more of a problem with an Andrew Huberman or a Tim Spector more than I would have over the worst influencer out there, because I don't expect that influencer to know shit. I don't expect them to know anything about the scientific method or whatever it is they're talking about. So to me, it's the people who should know better, and you would assume because of their training do know better, but are clearly taking a road with the information they are putting out that is so utterly contrary to that training, to that method, that I find that, if it was just influencers putting out bad information about diet and lifestyle and whatever, you could combat that. When people with the kind of credentials that a Huberman has or a Tim Spector has enter the fray, not in support of science, but in support of their own agenda and put out bad information, then the whole thing is a mess. And I think they're much more responsible as individuals for putting out that information, because there's no reason why every single podcast he puts out couldn't have very well communicated, factual, evidence-based information. So there's a choice being made here.
That's not right, is it? Wouldn't that be too much work? I mean, I don't know, he's doing something once a week. How on earth, something new once a week, and I'm not defending him, how on earth, unless he has a massive team of researchers behind him, how on earth can he scrutinize all of these claims? And I'm not defending him.
Yeah, as well, that's sort of as the podcast would grow, I would assume that you would look to bring on, I don't know, a couple of PhD students that are well read, or expand your team for people that have different domain specific expertise. Like that's his responsibility as the scale of his audience and the reach grows, to build out a team that, sure, he's not relying on necessarily doing every bit of research himself, but he's got a good team of people trained in the same intellectual discipline that are actually, providing him with that information. So, and look, I know it's onerous. If me and Danny are preparing for a Sigma Nutrition episode where we're taking on a specific area, there's a lot of work that goes into producing that podcast. We read a lot of research papers. We're analyzing those papers. We're thinking about it and how we're going to communicate that. So I do appreciate there is a lot of work involved in that. And I would just say that, yeah, as it's growing, surely that's more his responsibility now to say, I want this to keep being something which is very reliable and information that has scientific integrity behind it. So as I'm growing, that means I'm going to get a couple of these postdoc researchers at Stanford to come on board and be my background researchers or whatever. But I still think the buck stops with him.
Do you think he can be forced, I use that in the most general possible term, to be held to account?
No, because it's information in the public sphere, right? What I do think he could probably do is, there's obviously now, you said a point that I think is interesting, Nick, and is actually accurate, which is, as someone grows, there will be more checks and balances in place. So we're seeing it happen with Huberman, where you're getting people like me and other people, certainly in nutrition from the kind of evidence-based side, are being very vocal about their criticism of a lot of the information he's putting out. I've seen other people from other domains that I don't know anything about, physiotherapists, for example. I've seen a lot of criticism come out about some of the kind of stuff he's, recommended for recovery and things like that. So there is a check and balance occurring. Stephen Bartlett's the same. There's a lot of people that liked his podcast for business advice and stuff like that. And he's just been on a run of platforming complete quacks in the kind of nutrition and health space over the last while. He's facing a huge amount of criticism now for platforming, really uncredible people. For someone like a Huberman, that's an opportunity, I think, to then say, okay, I'm taking a bit of flack here. Who can I have conversations with, or where can I have conversations that could allow a redress on this, and I'd like to see him seek that out. I'd like him to probably start to accept that his own domain-specific experience and expertise will only go so far. Primarily neuroscience is his own field, and start to widen out a bit more. But yeah, I think the checks and balances happen, but I think it says a lot about who and how they ultimately deal with that kind of pushback that starts to come.
I would agree. Another question. Did you see the Stephen Bartlett Dragon's Den furore?
No, I've missed this, and I've seen a lot of people getting wound up, but I haven't seen The Dragon's Den. If this is the recent thing, was it?
Nick, give us the top line for people that haven't seen it.
Well, I haven't seen it. I've just read about it. It's what do they call it? Oracular therapy, ear therapy, and it's sticking some little seed, some gold seed in some ear fold in your earlobe, and this woman claiming it can cure ME and chronic fatigue and all this kind of stuff. And it was a plant. She was lined up by the BBC. Stephen Bartlett's brother is a director of the company already. Yeah, I mean, you know, my view is, because Alan mentioned Stephen Bartlett is that perfect storm of commercial, I'm going to pick my words very carefully here, commercial fast talker chasing the biggest bucks and the biggest reach meets health and fitness influencer, and let's do anything I can to make money and get eyeballs on me, no matter what.
I guess this all ties in with one thing I wanted to talk about quickly, is that there is a spectrum, right, of influencer. And I think you don't really expect anything from a Stephen Bartlett, and you don't really expect Joe Rogan to properly hold people to account when he's interviewing them. But when you've got someone who's a tenured professor at Stanford, there is a built-in trust there, right? There has to be, from their position. So, Nick, do you go along with what Alan's saying about you kind of expect better from people there? If you've got a doctor in a supermarket screaming at broccoli for giving people cancer, I think most people can probably go, do you know what? I'm not going to buy into this. Mm-hmm. But if you're watching something that's got this scientific setting, and he is a tenured professor at a leading university, people are, part of his appeal is that people are buying into him naturally before he's said a word, right? So are you disappointed that he should be doing better?
It's a hard one. I cannot, it makes more interesting viewing for me to disagree with Alan, but I can't disagree with anything he's saying. I just go back to the areas that I have knowledge of, that I've heard Huberman talk about, have made me, I don't always agree, but they've made me think, they've made me dig deeper. I kind of want to give him the benefit of the doubt that I think he's a genuine guy, honestly. But I would also say, Alan's points are 100% spot on. The podcast has such reach. If he's too stretched to research the things that he's discussing, the money is there, because it's always about money. The resource is there to dig deeper. And does he have a responsibility because of his position? Yes, he does. So what would I like to see from Huberman? I'd like to see Huberman do retrospectives. I'd like to see Huberman layer in a bit more nuance, but if you layer in nuance, you lose your audience, right? You've got to remember that. No one wants nuance. No one wants it depends as an answer. No one wants that. Everyone wants this.
So that leads me nicely on to how I wanted to round off with a quick game of saint or sinner. And because this is the internet, there's no sitting on the fence. It's saint or it's sinner. We'll take it out if we're worried about getting sued afterwards. Don't worry, it's not live.
Okay, yeah, we'll edit what needs to be edited, Alan. Yeah, don't worry about that.
I'm gonna start off. Alan, if you go first, and then Nick immediately afterwards. First thing that comes into your head, I'm just going to read through a list of names. We'll start with the obvious. Right. Okay, here we go. Saint or sinner? Andrew Huberman.
I'm going to go with sinner.
And I'm going to go more with saint.
Peter Attia.
God, I don't know enough about him.
You know what, this game is going to morph into how can I get Alan to say saint, isn't it?
Yeah. I'm just going to go with sinner.
And I'm going to say saint because I've not seen him make any claims, but that doesn't mean he's not. But to me, this is like a super nerdy doctor trying to maximize longevity and everything else and kind of experiment on himself. But I will say, I believe his service, don't quote me on this, I know someone that paid for his service that didn't continue it. And is it 400 grand or 700 grand a year?
Yeah, it's something.
Like that level of, that amount of cash. That amount of cash. Cash, yeah.
Okay. I've got to be honest, in this game of Saint and Sinner, we're going to form so far. I think Nick's being quite sympathetic. Alan, pulling no punches, but we'll crack on. Shawn Baker.
Oh, sinner. in Dante's seventh circle.
I'd probably go sinner as well, to be honest with you.
Carnivore MD.
Sinner.
Are they a different person?
Yeah, Shawn Baker is the author of The Carnivore Diet. Carnivore MD's Paul Saladino.
Oh, Paul Saladino's a sinner.
Glucose Goddess.
The sinner. Yeah.
Sinner.
Michael Mosley.
Sinner.
Sinner, yeah.
Because you can be right with some things and wrong with lots of others. You know, you throw enough shit at a wall and it sticks. That's Michael Mosley, to sell books and newspaper columns.
Layne Norton.
I'll gotta go with Saint with Layne.
No, I would say sinner because of the way he conducts himself. Forget about and I'm playing the man, not the ball there.
And Stephen Bartlett.
Sinner.
Sinner.
Right. Okay. We're going to have to take a time out here, Alan, because you've had one saint there. So in your esteemed position, and Nick, we'll come to you afterwards. Who can people go out there and listen to? Who is worth their time of a follow or a podcast, whatever it will be? Because you've both probably come down there more on the sinner side than saint. So who are the good eggs out there?
I think there's a few obviously I'm going to keep this specific to nutrition as much as I can. But, I would say that if anyone, isn't following Danny Lennon and Sigma Nutrition and the podcast that, I'm fortunate enough to co-host a lot of episodes with him on, I would say that's the best source podcast that is genuinely dedicated to communicating science-based nutrition information. I think there's also Simon Hill's podcast. Simon's an Aussie, has a podcast that very much in the last year specifically is kind of taken a similar route of interviewing academics doing nutrition research. And I think what other kind of nutrition podcasts might I listen to? There's various people on social media as well that are very good with communicating nutrition. There's Gil Carvalho's YouTube channel, Nutrition Made Simple. Dr. Matt Nagra. There's a lot of, who else? Adrian Chavez. There's good people communicating nutrition on social media and then on podcasts and YouTube.
And Nick, over to you. Whose work do you like? Who do you rate? Who do you think we should listen
to? On nutrition?
On the influencer space mainly. Anyone out there doing good work?
Is Alan an influencer?
No, he was listing some influencers.
No, but I would, on nutrition, Alan's stuff is just very, very interesting. But it's not for everyone because it's too intellectually rigorous and it's not nuanced. It is nuanced, sorry, Alan. It is nuanced. It's highly nuanced.
Dagger to my heart.
It's highly nuanced. You can look at the people I follow. I follow an eclectic mix of people. And do I follow a Huberman? I'll follow a Huberman, but does that mean I endorse anyone? I don't particularly endorse anyone. I think in the whole health and wellness space, it's so. Do you agree with this, Alan, or do you think I am being too reductive? Nutrition and diet. Healthy nutrition, healthy diet, for the general, for 80% of people, 80% of the time, it isn't complicated. It's pretty straightforward. And the challenge, of course, is the adherence and the confusion.
I've said this a lot kind of over the last year or so. We kind of know what we need to know from nutrition research has brought us to a point where, and this is again, the knock on personalized nutrition to an extent, like we don't need to personalize eating fruits and vegetables, eating more fiber, improving the composition of fat in your diet, fueling appropriately for your sport or activity, consuming enough total energy, or depending on your actual related goals, like consuming less energy or consuming more energy as it may be required. Like the broad principles of what constitutes a healthy diet are now well known to us. And there's not that much variation in the level of that advice unless someone had a specific condition, like their celiac, for example. So I think you're right. And I think what annoys me, I guess, now is that all of this wider conversation, fad diets, quack diets, all of this stuff really detracts us from that simplicity. And the simplicity itself, like you said, that the problem isn't the simplicity of what we know. The problem is helping individuals and indeed a population navigate whatever they need to navigate in order to adhere to those well-known and simple principles. So we're kind of arguing over the wrong thing. You know, if we want to personalize things, then what we need to do is personalize the factors that get in the way of that adherence for a given person.
So the main problem is the answer is quite simple. It's just you can't commercialize it, which is why we keep having these same conversations, especially this time of year.
You know, some of the apps will commercialize it because they'll gamify it and they'll make following a diet engaging. So it's how do you engage people? The critical factor is how do you influence people to be mindful of their food? How do you influence people to be mindful of the way that food makes them feel? And we're switched off. We've switched off. How do you stop people from, you know, some people are physiologically wired to feel good with a full stomach. This is something you never hear anyone talk about. How much of that is the cause of obesity? Because I feel good. You, Joe, 100% don't feel good with a full belly. I can tell straight away. You're the kind of person, not to get into like something blunt like somatotyping, but you can see someone like Joe doesn't feel good with a full stomach. Someone like me, I feel good with a full stomach. I feel good going to bed with the fullest stomach possible. This is terrible for me. How do you stop people from having that? How do you stop people from going to the supermarket when they're hungry? Because if you go to the supermarket when you're hungry, it's an absolute disaster. So those are the questions that people should be debating. But the problem is, in the wider fitness industry, which I'm a part of, that's not very interesting. And then people want to talk about their cults and their stance and everything else rather than how do we actually just help people change their relationship with food, learn to be hungry sometimes, right? We should learn to be hungry. You know, the fight in the fitness industry, if we want to wrap this up from my side, the fight in the fitness industry, the fight in the nutrition industry shouldn't be with each other. The fight should probably be, if we're going to fight someone, we should be fighting big food, if we can call it big food.
Well, that's probably a fight for another day because we're bang out of time and we might need to tool up a little bit before we take that one on. But thank you so much, Nick. It's been an absolute pleasure. Alan, thank you so much. I really hope you've enjoyed this. As always, any comments, any feedback, any thoughts, we'd love to hear it. So please do drop a comment below. And we'll be back next time with the Unfiltered Roundtable.